The land did not care for a person's hopes. It stretched out under a sky so wide and empty it could swallow a man's soul. A vast and lonely canvas of dun-colored plains that rolled toward the jagged teeth of the mountains in the west. The wind was a constant presence, a dry whisper through the prairie grass in summer and a razor-edged howl in winter, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. It was a place of brutal beauty, where a sunset could set the horizon ablaze with colors no painter could mix, and a sudden blizzard could bury a herd of cattle in a single night. Life here was a bargain struck with the dirt and the sky, and the terms were never negotiable. Nestled in a shallow dip in the plains, like a handful of pebbles tossed into a blanket, was the town of redemption. Its name was a prayer said by its founders, but the prayer had long since been answered with a shrug. A single, dusty street, rutted by wagon wheels and flanked by weathered wooden buildings, formed its heart. There was a general store, a saloon whose swinging doors sighed open and shut with every gust of wind, a blacksmith's forge that rang with the steady rhythm of a hammer on steel, and a whitewashed church whose steeple seemed to be pointing an accusing finger at the heavens. Redemption was a place of community, where neighbors would help raise a barn or sit with a sick child. It was also a place of cruel judgment, where whispers in the mercantile carried more weight than a judge's gavel, and a person's reputation could be stripped bare and left to bleach in the sun like an animal's bones. For Ilara Calloway, the town and the land had become one and the same, a constant, pressing weight. She was a widow, a word that felt too small and too sharp for the hollowed-out space she now occupied. It had been 6 months since they buried Thomas. 6 months since the world had tilted on its axis and left her standing on a slope too steep to climb. The homestead, once a place of shared dreams and calloused hands clasped in the twilight, was now just a collection of chores that never ended. Her day began before the sun, in the chill air of the small cabin she and Thomas had built with their own hands. The silence was the first thing she noticed. Every morning, it was a physical thing, an absence that used to be filled with the sound of his breathing beside her, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards. Now, there was only the mournful cry of the wind around the eaves. She would pull on her worn dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, her mind already cataloging the day's labor. The cow needed milking, the chickens feeding, the leaky patch on the roof needed seeing to before the next rain, and the woodpile was shrinking faster than she could replenish it. Each task was a ghost of a memory. Splitting logs for the fire. Her arms ached with an unfamiliar burn. The axe felt clumsy and heavy in her hands, and she could almost hear Thomas's voice, a gentle tease in her ear, a little more follow-through. Ilara, let the weight of it do the work. He had been a man of quiet strength, his hands large and capable, his smile a slow, warm thing that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. He was respected in redemption, a farmer whose word was good and whose handshake was a bond. The sheriff had called his death an accident, a spooked horse, a fall into a rocky ravine on the far edge of their property. It was a story that made sense in a land where death could come from a snake bite, a fever, or a misplaced step. But the whispers in redemption told a different story. They were never spoken directly to her. Of course, she only felt them in the way eyes slid away from hers at the general store, in the sudden hush that fell when she approached a group of women talking by the church. They whispered of Thomas's arguments with Silas Blackwood, the powerful rancher whose land bordered theirs on 3 sides, a man who collected acres the way some men collected coins. They whispered that Thomas's horse was too steady to spook without reason. The whispers painted a picture of something dark and deliberate, but they offered no comfort, only a corrosive suspicion that poisoned her grief. The community's pity had a sharp edge. It felt like they were watching her, waiting for her to fail, waiting for the day she would give up, sell the homestead for a pittance, likely to Silas Blackwood, and disappear. The weight of their eyes was as heavy as the buckets of water she hauled from the well. She was a woman alone, a thing to be pitied, judged, and ultimately erased. The isolation was a kind of starvation, a hunger for a single kind word that was not tinged with condescension, for a look that was not filled with suspicion. Today, the loneliness was a sharp, physical pain in her chest. A fence post had rotted through, and a section of the barbed wire sagged uselessly to the ground. She spent the morning trying to dig a new post hole, her shovel clanging against the hard, unforgiving earth. Sweat stung her eyes and plastered stray strands of her brown hair to her forehead. Her back screamed in protest. It was a man's work, a two-man job, and she was only one woman, with half a heart. Finally, she threw the shovel down, a sob of frustration catching in her throat. She looked at her hands, raw and blistered. These were not the hands Thomas had held. They were the hands of a lonely, desperate creature, scrabbling to hold on to the wreckage of a life. The emptiness of the plain stretched around her, a mirror of the emptiness inside. She could scream, and only the hawk circling high above would hear. Driven by an impulse she did not understand, a need to escape the accusing silence of the cabin and the unending list of tasks, she walked. Her feet carried her away from the homestead, toward the low rumble of the river that marked the western boundary of her property. The river was swollen with the last of the mountain snowmelt, its voice a deep, angry growl. It churned a muddy brown, tearing at the banks, its surface roiling with powerful, unseen currents. She stood on a high, grassy bank overlooking the water. This was where she and Thomas had come on summer evenings, to watch the sunset paint the water gold. He had pointed out the spot where they would one day build a bigger house, with a porch that faced the mountains. Now, the memory was an agony. She sank to her knees, the grief she held back with every swing of the axe, every stitch of mended cloth, finally breaking free. It poured out of her in a raw, ragged wave of despair. Why had he left her here? Why was she forced to fight this losing battle alone? Her tears blurred the churning water into a formless, swirling mass. Overwhelmed, she leaned forward, her body shaking with sobs. The damp earth of the riverbank, already weakened by the current, gave way beneath her. There was no time to cry out, no time to think. One moment she was kneeling on solid ground. The next she was tumbling through the air, hitting the shockingly cold water with a violent splash that stole the breath from her lungs. The cold was a living thing. It was a predator, sinking its teeth into her flesh, locking her muscles, paralyzing her mind with its sheer, brutal force. The current seized her immediately, dragging her under, tumbling her over and over in a disorienting, suffocating darkness. Her heavy wool skirt wrapped around her legs like a shroud. She fought against it, her arms and legs thrashing wildly. But it was like fighting a giant. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped a mouthful of water and air before being pulled under again. Panic, cold and absolute, clawed at her throat. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with dignity, not with peace, but in a frantic, losing battle against an indifferent force of nature. The fight began to drain out of her limbs growing heavy, her mind foggy. The roar of the river was the last sound she would ever hear. Jedediah saw her from a distance. He was just a man passing through, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes holding the flat, watchful gaze of someone who had spent too much time in wide-open spaces. He rode a sturdy buckskin horse, leading a pack mule, his possessions pared down to the essentials. He was not heading anywhere in particular, just moving west, a habit he had fallen into years ago. He was tracing the line of the river, looking for a place to make camp for the night, when he caught the flicker of movement on the opposite bank. A figure, small and dark against the green grass. Then, it was gone. He reined in his horse, his eyes narrowing. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He had seen something. He watched the spot, his body tense with a stillness born of long experience. Then he saw it again. A flash of dark cloth, a pale hand, breaking the surface of the churning river before being swallowed again. He did not hesitate. There was no conscious thought, no weighing of risks. There was only a problem in front of him. And he was a man who solved problems. He spurred his horse down the sloping bank, into the shallows. He kicked his feet free of the stirrups and threw himself from the saddle into the icy water. The cold hit him like a hammer blow, but he pushed through it, his powerful strokes cutting through the current, his eyes locked on the spot where he had last seen her. He reached her just as she was giving up. Her struggles had weakened, her body going limp. He grabbed a handful of her dress, hauling her head above the water. She choked and gagged, her eyes wide with a terror that was quickly fading into unconsciousness. He hooked an arm firmly across her chest, turning on his back and kicking hard for the shore. The river fought him for every inch, its current trying to pull them both down into the depths. He was strong, his muscles corded from a life of hard labor, but by the time his boots scraped against the muddy bottom, his lungs were burning and his arms felt like lead. He dragged her out of the water and onto the muddy bank, her body as limp as a rag doll. He knelt beside her, pushing on her back until she coughed up a lungful of river water. Her breathing was a series of shallow, ragged gasps. Her skin was a frightening, bluish white, and she was shivering, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire frame. He knew the river was only the first danger. The cold was the next. It was already sinking deep into her bones. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. He carried her up the bank, his boots sinking into the soft earth, his gaze scanning the area. He saw the small, lonely cabin set back from the river, a thin curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Her home. He walked toward it, his long strides eating up the ground. He kicked the door open with his boot and carried her inside. The cabin was sparse and clean, but it held the chill of a fire long neglected. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room. A narrow bed was pushed against one wall. A patchwork quilt neatly folded at its foot. A stone hearth dominated the far wall, its ashes cold and gray. It was the home of someone struggling, the air thick with a quiet, persistent poverty. He laid her down gently on the braided rug in front of the hearth, her teeth chattering audibly. Her wet clothes were plastered to her skin, leaching away what little warmth she had left. He knew he had to get them off her, and he had to get a fire going, fast. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a man accustomed to emergencies. He found the wood pile outside, his arms gathering a load of dry logs and kindling. Inside, he knelt at the hearth, his back to her, and with practiced hands, he arranged the wood, struck a match, and coaxed the kindling into a small, hungry flame. He turned back to her. The shivering had grown more violent. He found a stack of blankets in a wooden chest at the foot of her bed. He unfolded them, his mind working quickly. The fire would take time to heat the small cabin. The blankets would help, but the wet clothes were a death sentence. He was a stranger, a man who had just pulled her from a river. He knew the rules of decency, the lines that were not to be crossed, but he also knew the rules of survival, and they were far more brutal and absolute. He knelt beside her, his presence large and solid in the small room. He looked at her face, her lips blue, her eyelids fluttering. He was a man of few words, and he could think of none now that would make this easier. He started to reach for the top button of her dress, his movements hesitant, respectful. Her eyes fluttered open. They were a hazy, unfocused blue, filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. She saw a large man, a stranger, his face grim in the growing firelight, his hand reaching for her. A small, animal sound of terror escaped her lips. He froze, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. He understood her fear. He was a rough-looking man, his clothes soaked, his face shadowed with a day's worth of stubble. He stayed kneeling, his hands resting on his own knees, letting her see he meant no harm. "You were in the river," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "The cold will kill you if we do not get you warm." Ilara tried to process his words. The river, the cold. The memory came back in a terrifying rush. She could feel the icy water, the pull of the current, and she could feel the cold now, a deep, penetrating ache that seemed to be freezing her from the inside out. She tried to sit up, but a violent shiver racked her body, and she fell back, weak and helpless. She looked at the man. His eyes were not cruel. They were serious, concerned. He was keeping his distance, respecting her fear, but his gaze kept flicking to her soaked dress, then to the growing fire. He was right. The cold was a physical presence in the room, and it was winning. She was trapped in a nightmare, saved from one death only to face another, slower and colder. And this man, this stranger, was the only thing standing between her and the encroaching freeze. She saw the conflict in his face, his desire to help and his reluctance to cross a boundary. The situation was impossible. She was too weak to help herself, and he was too decent to force himself upon her. Her desperation was a physical thing, a knot of terror in her stomach. She had to choose, and there was only one choice that led to mourning. A different kind of fear surfaced, the fear of a woman alone, vulnerable, making a desperate plea to a man she did not know. The words felt foreign and heavy on her tongue. Her voice, when it came, was a trembling, broken whisper, hardly louder than the crackle of the new fire. "Will you stay if I undress?" The question hung in the air between them, raw and layered with meaning. It was a plea for her life, a surrender to her own helplessness. It was an acknowledgement of his power in that moment, and a fragile, desperate test of his character. It was the question of a woman who had lost everything, who had nothing left to bargain with but her own vulnerability. Jedediah's face did not change, but a stillness came over him. He heard the words, but more than that. He heard the terror and the exhaustion beneath them. He heard the plea of a person at the very end of their rope. He looked at her, and he saw not a woman offering a proposition, but a survivor fighting for her next breath. He understood that his answer would define him, not just to her, but to himself. His gaze met hers, and for a long moment, the only sounds were the fire and her chattering teeth. He gave a single, slow nod. "I will stay," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. The words were a promise, a vow. He stood up and turned his back to her, facing the fire, presenting her with the solid, unmoving wall of his shoulders. "I will not look," he added, his voice low. "Get out of the wet things. I will put another log on the fire." His simple act of turning away was a profound gesture of trust and honor. It told her everything she needed to know. A wave of relief, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over Alara, with fumbling, frozen fingers. She worked at the buttons of her dress. Her hands were clumsy, almost useless. A small sound of frustration escaped her. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Jedediah did not turn. He remained facing the fire, giving her his back. "Tell me what to do." His continued respect, even now, was a small, steady anchor in the terrifying sea of her vulnerability. "The buttons," she managed to say. "My fingers, they will not work." He knelt down beside her, his back still turned. A difficult and awkward position. He reached back, his large, calloused hands searching for the front of her dress. His touch was hesitant, impersonal, his fingers brushing against the cold, wet fabric. He found the first button and worked it free from its hole, then the next, and the next. He did not speak. His movements were methodical, careful, his focus entirely on the task. When the dress was unbuttoned, he pulled his hands away. "Can you manage the rest?" he asked, his voice rough. She nodded, though he could not see it. "Yes." She managed to push the wet dress off her shoulders and shove it down her legs, along with the heavy petticoats beneath. She was left in her thin chemise and drawers, still damp and clinging to her skin. The cold air hit her, and the shivers intensified. She pulled one of the dry, rough wool blankets he had laid out around her shoulders, huddling into its meager warmth. "It is done," she whispered. Jedediah turned around then. He kept his eyes carefully on her face, ignoring her bare shoulders and the flimsy material of her underthings. He saw the violent shivering, the blue tint of her lips. He picked up the other blankets and began to wrap them around her, cocooning her in layers of wool, tucking them tightly around her feet and shoulders until she was a shapeless bundle on the rug. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his touch gentle but firm. When he was finished, he stood and added a larger log to the fire, which was now blazing, casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He dragged one of the simple wooden chairs close to the hearth, but not too close to her, and then he sat down. He did not speak. He simply sat, a silent guardian. His large frame silhouetted by the flames, he rested his forearms on his knees and stared into the fire, his presence a solid, reassuring weight in the quiet cabin. Outside, the wind picked up, howling its lonely song. But inside, the fire crackled. The woman breathed, and the man kept his vigil. Through the long, dark hours of the night, he did not move, a silent testament to a promise made, an unspoken bond of trust and safety forged in the heart of a storm. The first thing Alara knew was warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that had soaked into her bones and pushed back the memory of the river's icy grip. Pale morning light, soft and gray, filtered through the single window of the cabin, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. For a moment, she was suspended in a state of pure sensation, adrift between a nightmare and the waking world. Then, memory returned, the fall, the suffocating cold, the stranger. Her eyes snapped open. She was on the floor, but not on the bare wood. She was nestled in a cocoon of every blanket she owned. Lying on the braided rug before the hearth, the fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers, but their residual heat was a comforting presence. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, her body aching with a profound, muscle-deep soreness. And then she saw him. He was asleep in one of the simple wooden chairs he had pulled close to the fire. His head was slumped to one side, his long frame folded uncomfortably into the small chair. The grim, imposing stranger from the night before was gone. In his place was just a man, asleep. The harsh lines of his face were softened. The watchfulness in his eyes was gone, replaced by the stillness of rest. A dark stubble shadowed his jaw. His damp clothes from the rescue had dried on him, leaving them stiff and creased. He looked weary, not dangerous. The reality of what had happened settled upon her not with a crash, but with a slow, dawning clarity. She had been on the verge of death, helpless and terrified. She had laid her life and her dignity in this man's hands with a single, desperate question, and he had answered not with actions, but with inaction. He had turned his back. He had sat a vigil through the entire night, a silent, sleepless guardian, ensuring the cold did not reclaim her. He had offered her a decency she had no right to expect, a profound respect that was more comforting than any fire. A hot flush of shame and a wave of overwhelming gratitude washed through her, leaving her weak. He had seen her at her absolute weakest, and his response had been one of simple, unwavering honor. A floorboard creaked under her slight movement, and his eyes opened instantly. There was no grogginess, no slow climb to consciousness. One moment he was asleep, the next he was awake and alert, his gaze sharp and clear. He straightened up in the chair, the weariness returning to his features as he took in the morning light. His eyes met hers, and a thick, awkward silence filled the small cabin. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice still raw. She clutched the blankets tighter around her. He stood, stretching the stiffness from his back. He was a tall man, his shoulders broad under his worn shirt. He walked to the cabin door and looked out, his gaze sweeping across the pale sky and the frost-kissed plains. He seemed to be a man more comfortable with landscapes than with small rooms. The storms passed, he observed, more to himself than to her. He turned back, picking up a battered hat from the floor where he had dropped it the night before. "You should be all right now. Stay warm. Keep the fire fed." He was preparing to leave. Of course he was. He was a drifter, a man passing through. He had done his part, a staggering act of life-saving kindness. And now he would move on, disappearing back into the vastness from which he came. The thought sent a surprising and unwelcome jolt of panic through her. His presence, which had terrified her at first, had become a shield during the night. The idea of being truly alone again, in the echoing silence of the cabin, was suddenly unbearable. He took a step toward the door, then paused. His gaze drifted past her, through the window, to the sagging section of fence. His eyes, she noticed, missed nothing. They took in the broken post, the dwindling woodpile beside the cabin, the general air of a homestead slowly succumbing to entropy. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "That fence needs mending," he stated. It was not a question or a judgment, just a simple fact. "And your woodpile is low for this time of year." Ilara felt a flush of defensive pride. "I was getting to it." He gave a slight nod, accepting her words, though they both knew they were a flimsy defense. "It is a two-person job. A few hours of work." He paused, turning his hat over in his hands. "I can stay the day. See to it, in exchange for a hot meal." The offer hung in the air. It was a simple, practical proposition. An act of kindness disguised as a transaction to spare her pride. A part of her, the part that had been shaped by the whispers and watchful eyes of redemption, screamed at her to refuse. To have a strange man stay, to work on her land, would be fuel for the gossip that was already smoldering around her name. It was improper. It was dangerous. But another part of her, the part that felt the deep ache in her muscles and knew the crushing weight of the labor ahead, was overcome with a desperate relief. The fence did need mending. The woodpile was dangerously low, and she was so very, very tired of being alone. I would be grateful," she said, her voice barely audible. "I have salt pork and some beans." "That will do," he said, and with another nod, he put on his hat and stepped outside into the crisp morning air, leaving her wrapped in a cocoon of blankets and conflicting emotions. They worked for hours in a silence that slowly transformed from awkward to comfortable. It was a silence filled with the rhythmic sounds of labor, the thud of his axe biting into dry pine, the scrape of her shovel against the hard earth, the grunt of effort as he set a new post into the ground. Ilara had changed into a dry dress and, despite the lingering soreness in her body, worked alongside him. She cleared the tangled brush from the fence line while he dug the new post holes. She watched his hands as he worked. They were large, calloused, and surprisingly deft. He moved with a quiet competence, a man who understood the language of tools and wood and earth. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He was strong, but it was a patient, enduring strength, not a boastful one. Jedediah, in turn, observed her. He saw the grim determination in the set of her jaw as she wrestled with a stubborn root, the resilience in her posture that fought against the weariness he knew she must be feeling. She was not built for this kind of work, her frame too slender, her hands too soft. But she did not shrink from it. Beneath the layers of her grief, he saw a core of iron, a stubborn refusal to be broken. Once, he stopped splitting logs and saw her stumble, her face pale with exhaustion. Before she could protest, he walked to the well, drew a bucket of cold, clear water, and brought a dipper to her. He offered it without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and drank deeply. Their eyes met for a second over the tin rim, a fleeting moment of shared understanding. Late in the morning, a rider approached. Ilara recognized the expensive, gleaming black stallion and the man who sat astride it with an air of absolute ownership. Silas Blackwood. He was a man in his 50s, handsome in a predatory way. his face clean-shaven, his clothes, a tailored coat and fine leather boots, too clean for the dusty world he ruled. He controlled the largest ranch in the territory, held the bank's mortgage on half the businesses in redemption, and moved with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no. He reined his horse to a halt near the fence line, his gaze sweeping over the scene, a flicker of something cold and unpleasant in his eyes as he took in the repaired fence and the growing woodpile. He dismounted, his movements smooth and practiced. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice a rich, oily baritone that dripped with false sympathy. He removed his hat, revealing thick, silvered hair. "I was saddened to hear about your troubles. Thomas was a fine man, a terrible, tragic accident." "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood," Elara said, her voice stiff. She did not like this man. Thomas had never trusted him. Blackwood had made several offers for their land, offers Thomas had politely but firmly refused. "I came to offer my condolences," Silas continued, his eyes roaming over the homestead, a merchant assessing goods. "And my help. This is a great deal for a woman to manage on her own. A terrible burden. Should you ever decide it is too much, well, I would be prepared to offer a fair price for the property, to ease your mind." The implication was clear. She was weak, she would fail, and he would be there to pick up the pieces. Before Elara could form a reply, Silas's eyes settled on Jedediah, who had stopped his work and was now standing by the woodpile, his axe held loosely in one hand. Silas's pleasant facade vanished, replaced by a look of sharp disdain. "And who is this?" he asked, his tone shifting from sympathetic neighbor to interrogator. "This is Mr. Elara began, realizing with a jolt that she did not even know her rescuer's name. "Jedediah," the man supplied, his voice calm and even. He did not move, but his presence seemed to solidify, becoming an unbreachable wall. Silas looked Jedediah up and down, his gaze lingering on the worn clothes, the stranger's face. "Jedediah," he repeated the name as if it tasted foul. "And what is your business here, on Mrs. Calloway's land?" "Fixing a fence," Jedediah said, his voice flat. "I see," Silas sneered. "The widow Calloway has found herself a hired hand. You move quickly for a grieving woman." The insult was directed at Elara, but his cold eyes were locked on Jedediah. "Redemption is a small town. Jedediah, we look out for our own. We do not take kindly to drifters and vagrants preying on vulnerable women." "I am not preying on anyone," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I am repaying a kindness." "Is that what you call it?" Silas laughed, a short, ugly sound. "See that you are on your way by nightfall. For your own good. We have a sheriff who knows how to deal with your kind." He put his hat back on, gave Elara a final, possessive look, and swung himself back into the saddle. "You think on my offer, Mrs. Calloway," he said, before turning his magnificent horse and riding away, leaving a trail of dust and palpable menace in his wake. The encounter left a stain on the rest of the day. The comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a tense awareness of the threat Silas represented. The next day, Elara had no choice but to ride into Redemption for supplies. The moment she stepped into the general store, she felt it. The air grew thick with unspoken words. Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, who had once shared recipes with her, gave her a curt nod and busied herself rearranging a display of canned peaches. Two women who had been chatting by the flour barrels fell silent, their eyes sliding away from hers. The whispers followed her down the aisle, insidious and sharp. "A man staying out at her place. So soon after poor Thomas passed. No shame. He looks like a rough one. I heard Silas Blackwood ran him off." The gossip was a venomous cloud, mixing the old suspicions about her husband's death with new slander about her character. They were painting her as a loose woman, a fallen widow taking up with a dangerous vagrant. The pity had curdled into outright condemnation. She gathered her flour and salt, paid in silence, and fled the store, the weight of the town's judgment a physical burden on her shoulders. She was no longer just a widow. She was an outcast. Jedediah, having finished the chores he promised, rode into town later that afternoon to provision his pack mule before moving on. He was a man accustomed to being invisible, and in the dim, smoky light of the saloon, he became just another shadow in a corner, nursing a beer. He listened to the low murmur of conversation around him. He heard Thomas Calloway's name. Sheriff said his horse spooked, threw him in the ravine, a grizzled trapper was saying to the man beside him. Funny thing is, the other man replied, a farmer with dirt under his nails. I knew that gelding of his, old Bess. You could fire a cannon next to that horse's ear, and she would not so much as flinch, rock steady. She was... Aye, the trapper grunted, and Sheriff Barnes closed the case faster than a sprung trap. Did not seem too interested in looking at the tracks. Silas Blackwood was out there the next day, though paying his respects. Jedediah said nothing. He finished his beer, his mind turning over the pieces. A spook-proof horse that spooked, a hasty investigation, a powerful neighbor who wanted the land. His instincts, honed by years of navigating the quiet dangers of the frontier, told him that the story the town was telling itself had holes in it. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He returned to the homestead as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. He had intended to say his goodbyes and ride on, to put redemption and its troubles behind him. But when he saw Elara standing on the porch, her small frame looking lost against the vast, darkening landscape, a solitary figure besieged by whispers and threats, he could not bring himself to leave. Not yet. That evening, they shared a simple meal of salt pork and beans at the small wooden table. The cabin, which had felt so cold and empty to Elara for months, was now a sanctuary. The fire in the hearth crackled and hissed, casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the encroaching night and the cold judgment of the world outside. For the first time since Thomas's death, Elara felt a small, fragile bud of peace. The food was plain, but it was a shared meal. The silence was not empty, but full of a quiet understanding. My father was a blacksmith, Jedediah said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low, and he seemed surprised by his own words. He could fix anything made of metal, said a man's worth was in what he could make, or what he could mend. The offering was small, a tiny piece of his past, but it felt momentous. Elara looked up from her plate, a genuine, startlingly beautiful smile touching her lips for the first time. It was a small, hesitant thing, like a winter flower, but it transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of grief, if only for a moment. My mother taught me how to read, she offered in return. She said words were the only thing no one could ever take from you. We did not have many books, but we read the ones we had until the pages were soft as cloth. They continued to talk, sharing small, impersonal stories that sketched the outlines of their former lives without revealing the deep wounds within. They spoke of harsh winters and good harvests, of stubborn mules and the surprising intelligence of crows. It was a brief respite, a quiet truce in the war against their respective sorrows. As the conversation lulled, their eyes met across the small table. The firelight played in the depths of her blue eyes, and, for the first time, he saw not just grief, but a profound and resilient strength. She looked at him and saw not just a drifter or a savior, but a man of quiet honor, whose presence had become a steadying anchor in her tumultuous world. In that long, silent gaze, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them. They were two isolated souls, adrift in a harsh and unforgiving world. The town had built a wall of prejudice around them, but inside that wall, in the warm, flickering light of the cabin, they had found a small, safe harbor, a fragile, burgeoning trust, as real and as vital as the fire that warmed them, had taken root. The sky began to turn that afternoon. The vast, benevolent blue of the morning bruised into a sullen, heavy gray along the western horizon. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, fell completely silent, leaving an unnerving stillness in its wake. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of dust and distant, unshed rain. Jedediah, who had been reinforcing a corner of the small chicken coop, stopped his work and looked west. His eyes narrowed. He had seen skies like this before. They were liars, promising relief and delivering violence. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried in the oppressive quiet. "A bad one." Ilara, who was tending to the small vegetable patch near the cabin, straightened up, wiping a smear of dirt from her cheek with the back of her hand. She followed his gaze to the line of dark, roiling clouds that looked like a mountain range rising from the plains. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature traced its way down her spine. Storms on the plains were not like storms elsewhere. They were living things, vast and wrathful, and they made a person feel terrifyingly small. They worked with a new urgency, securing what they could. He checked the roof of the cabin, hammering down a loose shingle, while she latched the shutters on the single window and brought the chickens into the relative safety of the coop. By the time they finished, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, large, cold, and heavy, kicking up little puffs of dust where they landed. They retreated into the cabin just as the sky opened up. The rain came down not in sheets, but in a solid, deafening torrent that hammered against the roof and turned the world outside into a formless, gray blur. The wind rose with it, a low moan that grew into a high, shrieking howl, rattling the door in its frame and finding its way through every tiny crack in the chinking. Darkness fell prematurely, and Ilara lit a lantern, its warm, steady glow a small, defiant island in the growing chaos. Then the lightning started. Great, jagged forks of it that tore the sky open, followed an instant later by cracks of thunder so loud and violent they shook the very foundations of the cabin. It was not a rumble. It was a physical blow, a concussive force that vibrated through the floorboards and into their bones. With each flash of lightning, the cabin was thrown into stark, momentary relief, every object casting a long, dancing shadow, and in that flickering, unnatural light, Ilara saw a change come over Jedediah. He was sitting at the table, but he was no longer there. His quiet, watchful calm had been stripped away, replaced by a rigid tension. His hands rested on the tabletop, his knuckles white. He stared at the wall, but his eyes were seeing something else, something far away and long ago. The next clap of thunder was directly overhead, an explosive, tearing sound like the world splitting in two. Jedediah flinched. A sharp, violent jerk of his entire body, and a low, guttural sound was torn from his throat. "Jedediah?" Ilara asked softly, her voice small against the roar of the storm. He did not seem to hear her. His breathing was shallow and fast. The lantern light caught the sheen of sweat on his forehead. He looked like a trapped animal, his gaze darting around the small cabin as if the walls were closing in. Ilara rose from her chair and walked to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. The simple, domestic act a small anchor in the storm's fury. She did not press him, but she did not look away. She simply watched, her presence a quiet question. Another blast of thunder shook the cabin. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It sounded like that," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing she had never heard before. "The gunfire." The word hung in the air between them, more shocking than the storm outside. Ilara waited. She knew this was a precipice. He was balanced on the edge of a great height, and the slightest wrong move might send him toppling back into silence. Slowly, haltingly, the story came out, dragged from a place of profound darkness. He spoke to the fire, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if the feelings were too large to be contained in words. He told her he had not always been a drifter. He had been a homesteader, in a valley 2 territories to the east. He had built a cabin with his own hands, broken the sod, and planted wheat. He had not been alone. "I had a wife," he said, the name a painful whisper. "Sarah, and a son, Daniel. He was 5 years old. He had his mother's laugh." He paused, swallowing hard. The storm raged outside, a fitting soundtrack to the tempest in his soul. He told her about a man there, a man like Silas Blackwood, who owned the valley and believed he owned the people in it. The man had wanted Jedediah's land, the best watered parcel in the whole territory. Jedediah had refused to sell, so the man had framed him. A few head of cattle were driven onto his land. The brand altered. A paid-off deputy came with a warrant for cattle rustling. "I was not going to let them take me," Jedediah said, his voice growing harder. "It was a hanging offense. I knew it was a lie. I thought I could fight it." But the man had not just sent a deputy. He had sent a posse of hired guns, telling them Jedediah was dangerous, that he would come out shooting. They had surrounded his cabin at dusk. He had sent Sarah and Daniel into the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, telling them to stay quiet, that he would handle it. "They called for me to come out," he said, his eyes hollow. "I told them I was innocent. Then they opened fire. They riddled the cabin with bullets. It was not an arrest. It was an execution." The thunder cracked again, and he winced, his body remembering. A stray bullet must have hit the lantern, or maybe it was the stove. The curtains caught fire. The whole cabin. It went up so fast. It was all dry pine. He had been pinned down by the gunfire, unable to move. He could hear the flames, a roar that drowned out the shooting. He could hear his son crying for him from beneath the floor. "I tried to get to them," he choked out, his voice finally breaking, the carefully constructed walls of his composure crumbling into dust. "The floor was on fire. I could not get to the cellar door. The smoke, He could not finish. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The stoic, unbreakable man she had known was gone, and in his place was a husband and a father, drowning in a grief so immense it was a miracle he was still breathing. He had not been a mysterious cowboy running from the law. He had been a man running from a ghost, the ghost of a little boy he could not save. Elara moved without thinking. She knelt on the floor beside his chair and placed a hesitant hand on his arm. His muscles were corded with tension, hard as stone. She did not offer empty words of comfort. There were no words for a pain like that. She simply stayed there, her small hand on his arm, a silent witness to his unraveling. After a long time, his sobs subsided, leaving a heavy, exhausted silence in their wake. The storm outside began to ease, the thunder moving off into the distance, the rain softening to a steady drumming on the roof. He lifted his head from his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed and bleak, but the wild, trapped look was gone. He looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time since the storm began. "He got the land," Jedediah said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They called it a tragic firefight. Said I resisted arrest. They never even looked for me. They just wanted me gone." His story, in its terrible, brutal simplicity, opened a door in Elara's own heart. His loss was not like hers. It was 1,000 times more violent and unjust. But the shape of the hole it left behind was one she recognized. She knew what it was to have your world burn down around you. "Thomas and I," she began, her own voice soft and thick with unshed tears. "We built this place together. Every log in these walls, every stone in that hearth. It was not just a homestead. It was a promise." She told him about their life together, not the tragedy of its end, but the quiet beauty of its existence. She spoke of their shared dreams, of planting an orchard on the south-facing slope, of one day having children who would run through the tall prairie grass. Theirs had been a true partnership, a bond built on shared labor, mutual respect, and a deep, quiet love that had been the bedrock of her world. "He was a good man," she said, her gaze drifting to the empty chair on the other side of the table. "Strong, and kind, but he was not a fighter. He believed in the goodness of people. He could not see the darkness in a man like Silas Blackwood. Then, she confessed the fear that haunted her waking moments and poisoned her dreams, a secret shame she had never voiced to anyone. "Sometimes," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I think it was my fault. I saw the way Blackwood looked at our land. I heard the threat in his voice. I should have made Thomas see it. I should have told him to be more careful, to not ride out alone. I should have been stronger. Maybe if I had been stronger, I could have protected him from whatever danger I could not see." It was the irrational guilt of the survivor, the terrible, haunting belief that she had failed in some fundamental way, that her love had not been a strong enough shield to protect her husband. Jedediah listened, his own grief momentarily set aside as he took in the depth of hers. He reached out and covered her hand with his own. His touch was warm and steady. "That is not your burden to carry," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "The darkness belongs to the man who makes it, not to the people who are left standing in the wreckage." In that moment, a profound and irrevocable shift occurred between them. The last walls of reservation and strangeness crumbled. They were no longer a widow and a drifter, a victim and a savior. They were two survivors, adrift on the same dark ocean. They were two souls who had looked into the abyss and recognized its reflection in each other's eyes. They understood each other's pain in a way no one else in the world ever could. The next morning, the world was washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue and air that was fresh and cool. But the fragile peace of their shared vulnerability was short-lived. The war Silas Blackwood was waging against her escalated. When Alara went into redemption a few days later, she was met with a new, more tangible form of hostility. At the general store, when she placed her order for flour and coffee, Mr. Gable, a man who had known her since she was a girl, could not meet her eye. "I am sorry, Alara," he mumbled, his face a mask of shame and apology. "Mr. Blackwood holds the note on this store. He has instructed me not to extend any more credit to you. Cash only from now on." The humiliation was a physical blow. She had only a few coins in her pocket, not nearly enough. She had always run a line of credit, settling up when the crops came in. To be cut off was to be strangled. She left the store empty-handed, the eyes of the other customers following her like a physical weight. The psychological warfare intensified. Silas's men, rough-looking ranch hands with cruel mouths and empty eyes, began to ride the perimeter of her land. They never crossed onto her property, but they were always there, a constant, menacing presence on the horizon. They would sit on their horses on the ridgeline, watching her, their message clear and chilling: "You are alone, and you are being watched." Jedediah, who had made no further mention of leaving, became her shadow, his quiet presence a constant counterpoint to the threat of Silas's men. He worked on the homestead, his axe ringing in the clear air, his quiet competence a reassuring rhythm in her days. But his eyes were always scanning the horizon, ever watchful. The cruelest blow came a week later. Alara went out to the small corral to milk Daisy, her one remaining cow, a gentle Jersey that had been a wedding gift from her father. She found the animal lying on its side in the dust. Its eyes were open and glassy, its body still. There was no mark on it, no sign of predators, no evidence of sickness. It was just dead. The unnatural stillness of it was more terrifying than any wound. It was a message, delivered with cold, calculated cruelty. It was Silas telling her he could touch her whenever he wanted, destroy her livelihood piece by piece, and leave no proof. Jedediah found her standing there, staring at the dead animal, her face a pale, frozen mask of disbelief and horror. He walked over, his boots silent in the dust. He looked at the cow, then at the distant ridgeline, where two riders were silhouetted against the morning sky. A cold, dangerous light entered his eyes. He said nothing to Alara. He simply squeezed her shoulder. a brief, hard gesture of solidarity, before turning and striding toward his horse. He swung into the saddle and rode out, not with the reckless speed of anger, but with a slow, deliberate pace that was far more menacing. He met the two riders in the open space between the properties. They were hard men, their faces unshaven, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. They watched him approach, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and curiosity. "That is far enough, drifter," one of them called out, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek. Jedediah reined in his horse a dozen yards away. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for his gun. He simply sat there, his stillness more potent than any threat. "The woman's cow is dead," he said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. The scarred man laughed. "Animals die. It is a hard country." "This is the last time you will ride this fence line," Jedediah said. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. "And this is the last time you will harm anything on her land. She is not alone anymore." "Is that a threat?" the other rider sneered, his hand moving closer to his pistol. Jedediah's eyes, gray and cold as a winter sky, locked onto the man. "It is a promise," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with deadly clarity across the space between them. "You see me here now. If anything else happens to her, or her property, I will not ride out to talk to you. I will come for you in the dark. You will not see me. You will not hear me. But you will know I was there." He held their gaze for a long, silent moment. The two men, accustomed to inspiring fear, found themselves on the receiving end of it. What they saw in Jedediah's eyes was not the hot anger of a cowboy looking for a fight. It was something colder, older, and far more terrifying. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had lost everything, who had nothing left to fear, and who would stop at nothing to protect the one small thing he had left to care about. The scarred man's bravado faltered. He exchanged a nervous glance with his partner. After a moment, he spat on the ground and jerked his reins. "We are just riding the line," he muttered, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "Then ride on," Jedediah said. The two men hesitated, then turned their horses and rode away, not looking back. Jedediah watched them go, his face an unreadable mask, before turning his horse and riding back to the cabin. He found Elara where he had left her, by the body of her dead cow. The frozen shock had shattered, and she was weeping. Great, silent tears that streamed down her face. All the fear, the humiliation, the relentless pressure, and now this final, cruel act of malice had broken through her carefully constructed walls of resilience. She was not just crying for a cow. She was crying for Thomas, for her lost dreams, for the utter, crushing injustice of it all. Jedediah dismounted and came to stand beside her. He looked down at her bent head, at the way her shoulders shook with each suppressed sob. Without a word, he reached out and gently pulled her toward him. She resisted for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, her grief pouring out of her in a raw, heartbroken flood. He held her, his one arm wrapped firmly around her shoulders, his other hand resting gently on the back of her head. He was a solid, unmoving presence in the midst of her storm, a rock she could cling to. He did not speak. He just held her, absorbing her sorrow, shielding her from the harshness of the world. The contact was not born of passion or desire. It was something far more fundamental. It was the desperate, unspoken comfort of one human soul reaching for another in the darkness. Her sobs slowly subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths. She did not pull away, but stayed resting against him, her cheek pressed against the rough fabric of his shirt, gathering strength from his stillness. The world had been stripped down to this one small, quiet moment. The vast, indifferent sky above, the tragic stillness on the ground below, and the solid, comforting warmth of the man who held her. He shifted slightly, and she lifted her head, her tear-streaked face tilted up to his. Her eyes were red and swollen, but they were clear. In his gaze, she saw not pity, but a deep, sorrowful understanding. She saw her own pain reflected there, alongside his. He slowly lowered his head, and his lips met hers. The kiss was impossibly gentle, as soft as a prayer. It was not a kiss of passion, but a profound solace. It tasted of salt from her tears and of a shared, unbearable grief. It was a tender, sorrowful, and deeply romantic gesture that asked for nothing, but promised everything. It promised not a future free of pain, but a future where the pain would be shared. It was a promise to stand together, a promise of sanctuary. It was a promise that in the vast, encroaching darkness, they would be each other's light. That kiss was not an end to sorrow, but a covenant made in its shadow. In the days that followed, a new quiet settled between Alara and Jedediah. It was not the awkward silence of strangers, nor the comfortable silence of companions. It was the solemn, purposeful quiet of allies who had acknowledged a shared enemy and a shared cause. The tenderness of that moment by the dead cow had forged something stronger than passion. It had forged a commitment. For Alara, his presence was no longer just a shield. It was a promise of action. For Jedediah, her safety was no longer a debt repaid. It was a purpose found amidst the wreckage of his own life. The fight for her future and the quest for justice for her past had become one and the same. Fueled by this silent vow, Jedediah began to move. His actions were quiet, methodical, almost invisible. He was a man accustomed to reading the subtle language of the wild, and he now turned that sharp, analytical gaze upon the carefully constructed lie of Thomas Calloway's death. He began not with questions, but with the land itself. He asked Alara to describe exactly where Thomas had fallen. Her voice was strained, but she told him of the rocky ravine on the far western edge of their property, a treacherous cut in the earth that was a well-known hazard. The next morning, under a sky the color of faded denim, Jedediah rode out alone. He found the place easily. It was a scar on the landscape, a steep-sided gash with a floor of jagged, unforgiving rock. He dismounted, leaving his horse tied to a scrubby juniper, and began his search not at the bottom, where Thomas's body had been found, but at the top, along the edge of the precipice. Sheriff Barnes had reported that the horse, spooked and wild, had thrown its rider before bolting. Jedediah walked the rim of the ravine, his eyes scanning the ground, reading the faint impressions in the hard-packed dirt like a man reading a letter. He saw the tracks of a single horse, Thomas's horse, moving at a steady walk. There were no signs of a sudden fright, no frantic, churning hoofprints of an animal fighting for control, no deep gouges in the earth from a panicked bolt. The tracks simply led to the edge, and then they were gone. It was too neat, too clean. He spent an hour quartering the ground, his patience endless, and then he found it, tucked under the low-hanging branches of a cedar. 20 yards back from the ravine's edge was another set of tracks. They were faint, partially scuffed over, but they were unmistakably there. The tracks of a second horse, a shod horse, waiting, and beside them, the faint outline of a man's boot print. Someone had stood there, watching, waiting in the trees. The official story claimed Thomas had been alone. The ground told Jedediah that was a lie. He worked his way back to the edge, his eyes missing nothing. He saw a place where the earth was unnaturally disturbed, a long, deep scuff mark that was not from a hoof. It was the mark of a heavy object being dragged, not a fall, a push. He made his way carefully down the treacherous slope into the ravine itself. The rocks still held a faint, dark stain in one place, a grim testament to the final moments of Thomas's life. But Jedediah was not looking at that. He was looking for what the sheriff had conveniently missed. Near the place of the fall, he found a single, spent rifle cartridge, its brass casing glinting in the sun. It was partially hidden beneath a loose rock. A man whose horse had spooked would have no reason to fire his rifle, but a man ambushing another might. He picked it up, its small weight feeling heavy and damning in his palm. He returned to the homestead near midday, his face grim. He went not to the cabin, but to the small shed that served as a tack room. Ilara, seeing the look on his face, had pointed him there earlier, telling him that Thomas's saddle and gear were just as the sheriff had returned them. He lifted the heavy leather saddle onto a stand. To a casual glance, it was fine, but Jedediah's hands were not casual. They were knowing. He ran his fingers over every inch of it, testing the stitching, feeling the suppleness of the leather. He paid special attention to the cinch, the wide strap that held the saddle fast to the horse. And there, on the underside, he found what he was looking for. A single, deliberate cut. It was not deep, no more than a nick in the thick leather, but it was strategically placed. It would not be noticed during saddling, but under the strain of a rider's weight, especially on uneven ground, it was designed to tear, to give way suddenly and catastrophically, sending an unprepared rider tumbling to the ground. It was murder, planned and executed with cold precision. The spooked horse was a lie to cover the sabotaged saddle. The second rider was the man who had waited to ensure the job was done. The man who had likely fired a shot to hurry the process along or to put the injured horse out of its misery before it could be found. The evidence was damning, but it was circumstantial. He had proof of a crime, but no proof of the man who committed it. His mind went back to the conversation he had overheard in the saloon. The farmer's insistence that Thomas's horse was rock steady. A horse like that would have been well known to the town stable hand. He thought of what Silas had done to Ilara's cow. The quiet, efficient cruelty of it. Silas had fired the stable hand shortly after Thomas's death. It was a thread, thin and frayed, but it was the only one he had. He found the man whose name he learned was Ben Tully living in a dilapidated shack behind the saloon, a place that smelled of stale whiskey and despair. Ben was a husk of a man, his hands trembling with a perpetual tremor. His eyes a watery, faded blue that held the ghost of a constant fear. He had been a good man with horses once, but his love for the bottle had cost him everything. Jedediah did not approach him with questions. That would only spook him. Instead, he came with a bottle of cheap whiskey, a commodity Ben Tully could no longer afford. He sat with the old man on a crate outside the shack as the sun began to set. And he did not speak of Thomas Calloway or Silas Blackwood. He spoke of horses. He spoke of long cattle drives and the ache in a man's bones after a hard day. He listened as Ben, his tongue loosened by the whiskey, talked of the old days, his voice filled with a mournful pride for the man he used to be. Jedediah let the old man drink, sharing the bottle, creating a fragile bond of shared vice and quiet understanding. Only when the bottle was nearly empty and the sky was dark did Jedediah gently guide the conversation. "I heard Thomas Calloway had a fine gelding," he said casually. "Steady, they said." Ben Tully's eyes clouded over. He nodded, staring into his tin cup. "Bess," he slurred. "Gentlest horse you ever saw. A child could ride her." "A horse like that would not spook easy." Jedediah prodded gently. The old man flinched. He looked around nervously, as if the shadows themselves had ears. "Should not talk about it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Ben," Jedediah said, his own voice low and steady. "I know it was not an accident. I know someone tampered with his saddle." The old man's face went pale. He started to shake his head, a frantic, terrified denial. "I am not the law, Ben," Jedediah continued, his voice calm and reassuring. "I am not looking to cause you trouble. I am looking for justice for his wife. She deserves to know the truth." Ben looked at Jedediah, his watery eyes searching the stranger's face. He saw no judgment, only a grim seriousness. He took a long, shuddering breath, the whiskey giving him a fleeting, liquid courage. "I did not see nothing," he began, the lie weak and reflexive. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the darkness. I saw one of Blackwood's men, Carver. He has a mean streak. He was hanging around the stables that morning, near Bess's stall. I did not think nothing of it at the time, but after I heard about Thomas and Mr. Blackwood let me go, I started to think." His voice trailed off into a terrified whisper. "Carver was there. That is all I know." It was enough. It was a name. It was the next link in the chain. Jedediah thanked the old man, left him with the rest of the whiskey, and slipped away into the night. But Jedediah was not the only one who was watching and listening. Silas Blackwood had eyes and ears all over redemption. He heard about the drifter asking questions at the ravine. He heard about him talking to the drunkard Ben Tully. He realized his mistake. Jedediah was not some simple saddle tramp who could be scared off. He was intelligent, he was persistent, and he was getting dangerously close to the truth. Silas decided it was time to remove the piece from the board, permanently. The plan was orchestrated with the same ruthless efficiency as Thomas's murder. A few days later, a traveling merchant, a man selling household goods from the back of a wagon, was found on the road 5 miles outside of Redemption. He was alive, but he had been badly beaten, and his cash box, along with a distinctive silver pocket watch, had been stolen. When the sheriff asked for a description of his attacker, the dazed and frightened merchant described a tall, quiet man with watchful eyes, a drifter by the looks of him. It was a perfect, if vague, description of Jedediah. The trap was set. The next afternoon, as Jedediah was riding back toward the homestead, Sheriff Barnes and a posse of 4 deputized townsmen rode out to meet him. They did not come with questions. They came with rifles raised. "Hold it right there! Jedediah!" the sheriff bellowed, his face a mixture of official importance and nervous sweat. "You are under arrest for the robbery and assault of Mr. Abernathy." Jedediah reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene. He saw the grim, determined faces of the townsmen, men who had already judged him. He saw the cold, triumphant look in the sheriff's eyes. He knew this was a play, and he was the unwilling star. A fight would be suicide and an admission of guilt. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands. They ordered him off his horse and roughly searched him. Then, with a theatrical flourish for the benefit of the posse, Sheriff Barnes searched Jedediah's saddlebags. Well, he said, pulling out a silver pocket watch that glinted in the afternoon sun. "What have we here?" Jedediah said nothing. His face was a mask of cold stone. He knew the watch had been planted. He knew he had been framed. He knew that in this town, a drifter's word against the sheriff's was worth less than nothing. They bound his hands and led him back to Redemption. The town turned out to watch, their faces a sea of condemnation. The whispers that had followed him for weeks now became open jeers. Their worst prejudices had been confirmed. He was a vagrant, a thief, a violent criminal. Elara Calloway had harbored a monster. He was thrown into the town's flimsy jail, a small stone building with a single barred window, to await a trial that would be swift and a verdict that was already decided. A hanging was all but certain. With Jedediah locked away, his reputation destroyed. Silas Blackwood believed Elara was finally broken. She was defenseless, her protector gone, her name dragged through the mud alongside his. She was completely and utterly alone, a final, ripe fruit ready to be plucked. He decided it was time to shatter her spirit completely, to burn away the last vestiges of her hope and leave her with nothing but ashes. That night, a suffocating darkness settled over the homestead. Elara sat in the cabin, the lantern unlit, staring into the dying embers of the fire. She had heard the news. She knew Jedediah was in jail, framed for a crime he could not possibly have committed. The injustice of it was a bitter, suffocating weight. The walls of the cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. The silence pressed in on her, no longer peaceful, but filled with a terrifying vulnerability. She must have dozed off in the chair, because the first thing she was aware of was a flicker of unnatural orange light against the window. It was followed by a strange, hungry, crackling sound that did not belong to the night. A primal fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. She scrambled to the door and threw it open. The sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. Her barn was on fire. Flames, brilliant and terrifying, were already licking up the dry wooden walls, climbing toward the roof. Great plumes of thick, black smoke billowed into the night sky, carrying with them the scent of burning hay and old pine. The fire was not an accident. It was a hungry, living entity, roaring as it consumed her life. This was not just a barn. It was the structure she and Thomas had built first, with their own 4 hands, during the hopeful summer after they were married. It was where they had sheltered their animals, where they had stored the fruits of their first meager harvest. Every beam, every plank, was soaked in memory. She could remember Thomas, his face streaked with sweat and sawdust, laughing as he struggled to lift a heavy rafter into place. She could remember the sweet smell of the hay in the loft, where they had sometimes sat on cool evenings, planning their future. The barn held her past. It was the key to her livelihood, and it was the symbol of all her hopes. And now it was being devoured by an inferno. She stood frozen, a helpless silhouette against the terrifying light. There was nothing she could do. The fire was too large, too ferocious. She was utterly powerless. She could hear the faint sound of horses riding away in the darkness. The job done, the message delivered. She watched as the roof beams groaned and then collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks and embers soaring into the blackness. The entire structure was a blazing skeleton, a funeral pyre for her dreams. The heat was a physical blow, and the roar of the flames was the sound of her world ending all over again. Hours passed. The fire burned itself out, its furious rage slowly dying down to a malevolent, glowing heap of rubble. The dawn came, gray and somber, revealing the full extent of the devastation. Where a proud, sturdy barn had stood, there was now only a blackened, smoking ruin. A few charred timbers pointed to the sky like accusing fingers. Ilara stood alone amidst the ashes. The chill of the morning air seeped into her bones, but she did not feel it. She was numb, hollowed out. She had lost her husband. She had lost her reputation. She had lost her protector. And now, she had lost her past. Silas Blackwood had taken everything. He had not just ruined her financially. He had staged a deliberate, methodical, and brutal assault on her very spirit. He meant to leave her with nothing, not even memory, not even hope. As she stood there, a solitary figure in a landscape of utter desolation, she faced the greatest tragedy since the day Thomas had died, and for the first time, she truly believed she was defeated. For a long time, Ilara did nothing but stand there, a lone figure in the gray light of dawn, breathing in the acrid smoke of her own ruin. The despair was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in her belly. Silas Blackwood had meant for this to be the final blow, the one that would pulverize her spirit and leave her begging to sign away her land, her life, her history. He had miscalculated. He had not accounted for the nature of fire. Fire can destroy, but it can also temper. It can burn away the soft, pliable parts and leave behind something hard and sharp and unbreakable. As the sun climbed higher, casting a pale, indifferent light on the smoking skeleton of the barn, something inside Ilara shifted. The profound, hollow ache of grief did not disappear, but it was consumed by a different kind of heat. It was the white-hot, clarifying fire of rage. The tears that had streamed down her face dried, and her sorrow cooled and hardened into something that felt like steel in her veins. She looked at the ashes of her past, at the cabin that was now a lonely outpost in a field of devastation, and she was no longer afraid. Fear had been burned out of her. She would not be a victim. She would not be erased. A new, chilling clarity settled over her. The fight was no longer about saving a piece of land. It was about reclaiming a life. It was about the truth. The town of redemption. Silas Blackwood. The corrupt sheriff. They had taken her husband, and now they had taken her protector. She saw with perfect, terrible vision that justice for Thomas and freedom for Jedediah were not two separate paths. They were the same fight, and she was the only one left to wage it. Her mind, once clouded with grief, was now a sharp, focused instrument. She had one advantage. Silas believed he had already won. He would be expecting her to crumble, to come to him broken and defeated. He would not be expecting her to fight back. Her first priority was Jedediah. He could not rot in that jail. The town was distracted. The burning of the widow's barn, the primary subject of gossip and feigned sympathy. No one would be paying close attention to the jailhouse. She formulated a plan, its pieces clicking into place with cold precision. She spent the morning making a show of her despair for any watching eyes, walking aimlessly through the ruins of the barn. But in the privacy of the shed, her hands were busy. She found an old, rusted file, its teeth still sharp enough for the soft iron bars of the jail. That afternoon, she baked a loaf of bread, her movements steady and deliberate. Inside the warm, crusty loaf, she concealed the file. She walked into redemption, forcing her shoulders to slump, her eyes to remain downcast. She played the part of the broken woman to perfection. She went to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Barnes, a portly man whose face was flushed with the easy confidence of a bully, looked up from his desk. "What do you want, Mrs. Calloway?" he asked, his tone impatient. "I brought some food for your prisoner," she said, her voice a convincing, trembling whisper. "It is not right for a man to go hungry, no matter what he has done." The sheriff grunted, mollified by her display of meek, Christian charity. It fit the narrative he wanted to believe. "Fine," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "But make it quick." She was allowed to approach the cell. Jedediah was sitting on the narrow cot, his face impassive, but his eyes, when they met hers, were sharp and questioning. She passed the loaf of bread and a canteen of water through the bars. "The creek bed," she whispered, her back to the sheriff. "North of the old hanging tree. At midnight. Create a diversion at the south end of town." His eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Then he gave a single, slow nod. His fingers closed around the bread, feeling the hard, foreign object within. That was all. She turned and left without another word, her heart pounding a hard, steady rhythm of defiance against her ribs. As night fell, Elara put the second part of her plan into motion. She crept to the south end of town, near the livery. A large trash barrel, filled with dry straw and refuse from the stables, stood in the alley. Striking a match, she tossed it in. The dry tinder caught immediately, flames leaping up with a startling whoosh. She did not wait to see the result. She slipped away into the darkness, melting back toward the north, her knowledge of every back alley and shadow in the town she had known her whole life serving her well. Minutes later, shouts of "Fire!" echoed through the quiet streets. It was the one cry that could rouse any frontier town from its slumber. She heard the sheriff bellowing orders, the sound of running feet, the frantic clanging of a makeshift fire bell. The diversion was working. The entire town's attention was focused on the south end. Jedediah had been waiting. He heard the commotion, the distant shouts. It was his signal. He worked quickly, the file rasping against the iron of the window bar. The jail was old, the iron soft. It was hard, grueling work, his muscles screaming in the cramped space. Sweat poured down his face. The file grew hot in his hands. Finally, with a soft groan of protesting metal, the bar gave way. He bent it back just enough to squeeze his broad shoulders through the opening. He dropped silently to the ground outside, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He paused only to retrieve his gun belt and rifle, which the sheriff had carelessly left on a peg in the office. Then he was gone, moving with a ghost-like silence through the night. They met at the designated spot, a dense copse of cottonwoods by the dry creek bed. He emerged from the darkness so quietly she did not hear him until he was right beside her. "You did well," he said, his voice a low rumble. "There is no time," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They will hunt you." She pushed a bundle into his hands, a small supply of dried meat, a full canteen, and a box of cartridges. "Follow the creek. It will hide your tracks. Stay in the hills. They will not look for you there for long. They think I am broken. They will not expect me to have a partner who is free." He looked at her, his face unreadable in the moonlight. He saw the woman he had pulled from the river, but she was transformed. The fear was gone, replaced by a formidable, icy resolve. He simply nodded. "What is your plan?" "I am going to destroy him," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion but a cold, hard certainty. "With the truth." He held her gaze for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the wilderness as silently as he had arrived. He was a fugitive now, a ghost in the harsh landscape he knew so well. The next day, Ilara began her own hunt. She played the part Silas expected. She rode into town, her face pale and drawn, a perfect portrait of a defeated widow. She went directly to Silas Blackwood's office at the bank. He greeted her with the same oily sympathy he had shown before, but his eyes held a triumphant, possessive gleam. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "A terrible tragedy. I came out this morning to see the damage for myself. I am so sorry for your loss." "You have won, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound broken and hollow. "I cannot fight any more. The homestead, it is just a place of ghosts now. I want to sell. I will take your offer." A slow, satisfied smile spread across his face. "A wise decision," he said. "You have been through so much. I will have the papers drawn up." "I want it to be done publicly," she said, looking up at him with pleading eyes. "At the saloon, tomorrow evening. I want the whole town to witness the signing. I want them to know I am leaving this place for good, that there is nothing left for me here." Her request fed his monumental ego. The public humiliation and final surrender of the stubborn widow Calloway would be the perfect capstone to his victory. "An excellent idea," he agreed readily. "A public demonstration that order has been restored to our community." With the final confrontation set, Ilara returned to the cabin with a singular, desperate purpose. She needed the proof Jedediah could not find. She needed Thomas's voice. She ransacked her own memories, replaying every conversation she had ever had with her husband about Silas Blackwood. Thomas had been a careful, meticulous man. He had not trusted Blackwood. She remembered him once, late at night, working at the table by lamplight, saying, "A man like Blackwood only understands power and money. I need to speak his language." What had he meant? He had been writing in a small, leather-bound book, a ledger. She had thought he was just tracking farm expenses. Now, she knew it had to be more. Where would he hide something so important? Not in the open. Thomas knew the land, the cabin, every secret nook and cranny. He would have chosen a place that was both safe and meaningful. She searched the cabin for hours, her frustration mounting. She looked in the flour bin, under the mattress, in the wood box. Nothing. Exhausted, she finally sank onto the floor beside their bed, her head resting against the rough wood of the frame. Her eyes fell upon a single floorboard beneath the bed. It was slightly different from the others. The nail heads were brighter, less worn. Thomas had replaced that board last winter after a leak. Her heart pounding, she retrieved a pry bar from the shed. With a groan of old wood, the board came loose, and there, nestled in the dark, dusty space beneath, was a small, oilskin-wrapped package. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. It was the leather ledger. She opened it. Thomas's neat, careful script filled the pages. It was exactly what she had hoped for, and more. He had documented every illegal and unethical business dealing of Silas Blackwood's he had ever heard of. He detailed how Silas had used threats and usurious loans to drive other small homesteaders out of business before buying their land for pennies on the dollar. And on the last few pages, he had documented his own final dispute with the man. Blackwood had tried to illegally dam the creek upstream from their property, diverting the water for his own vast herds. Thomas had discovered it and threatened to go to the territorial marshal. The last entry, dated 2 days before his death, read, "Met with S.B. today. He will not back down. He told me some men are better off keeping quiet if they know what is good for them and their families. He underestimates me. I will not be threatened." It was the motive, clear and undeniable. Thomas had been a threat to Blackwood's empire, so Blackwood had eliminated him. While Ilara found her weapon in the past, Jedediah hunted for his in the wilderness. He had the name Carver from the stable hand. He knew that men like Carver, when not needed for their master's dirty work, were often sent to the most remote parts of the ranch, to line shacks and distant cattle camps, where they could stay out of sight. He moved through the rough hill country of Blackwood's vast ranch like a wolf, living off the land, his senses sharp, his purpose a cold, hard weight in his gut. After 3 days of tracking, he found him. Carver was staying in a dilapidated line shack in a high, lonely canyon. Jedediah did not storm the cabin. He waited. He watched Carver's routine, learning his habits. He waited for the perfect moment. It came at dusk. Carver stepped outside to draw water from a nearby spring. His rifle left inside. Jedediah emerged from the rocks behind him, as silent as a mountain lion. Carver turned, his hand instinctively going for the pistol on his hip, but he froze when he saw the cold, unwavering barrel of Jedediah's rifle aimed directly at his heart. "We need to talk," Jedediah said, his voice flat. They went back inside the filthy shack. The confrontation was not a physical one. It was a battle of wills. Jedediah stood by the door, his rifle never wavering, his eyes cold and empty. "I know you sabotaged Thomas Calloway's saddle," Jedediah began, his voice dangerously quiet. "I found the cut. I know you waited for him at the ravine. I found your tracks, and I found the cartridge you left behind." Carver's face, already pale, turned the color of ash. He started to bluster, to deny, but the words died in his throat under Jedediah's unblinking stare. "Blackwood will not protect you," Jedediah continued, his voice relentless. "Men like him cut their loose ends. When this is over, you will be a liability. He will put a bullet in your back and bury you where no one will ever find you. You know I am telling the truth." Jedediah could see the truth of his words register in the henchman's terrified eyes. "You have one choice," Jedediah said, pressing his advantage. "You can tell the truth, and I will see to it that you get a fair trial with the territorial marshal. Or you can stay loyal to the man who is going to kill you. Either way, Blackwood's reign is over. The only question is whether you will be alive to see it." Carver stared at the cold, implacable man before him, and his nerve broke. He had built his life on being the one who inspired fear, but the terror he felt now was absolute. He began to talk, the confession tumbling out in a panicked, desperate torrent. A man trying to outrun his own damnation. The next evening, the saloon in Redemption was packed to the rafters. The entire town had turned out for the spectacle. Silas Blackwood stood near the bar, smug and triumphant, accepting congratulations from his sycophants. Sheriff Barnes stood beside him, looking pleased with himself. Ilara entered, on cue. She looked small and fragile, dressed in a simple black dress. She walked to the center of the room, holding the deed to her land. An expectant hush fell over the crowd. "I came here tonight, as promised, to sign over my land to Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the crowded room. She looked directly at Silas, whose smile widened. "But first," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I want everyone to know why." She held up the leather ledger. "This was my husband's. In it, he documented years of Silas Blackwood's crimes. He wrote about how Blackwood drove decent men from their land. And he wrote about how, just before he died, he threatened to expose Blackwood for illegally diverting the town's water for his own profit. The crowd began to murmur. Silas's smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he snarled. "The woman is mad with grief." "My husband was murdered because he was a threat to this man," Alara's voice rang out, sharp and clear as a bell. "He was not killed by a fall. He was killed by greed." "This is slander," Blackwood roared. "Sheriff, arrest this hysterical woman." At that exact moment, the swinging doors of the saloon burst open. Jedediah stood there, silhouetted against the night. He was no longer the beaten prisoner, but a figure of cold, hard justice. He was not alone. He held the bound and terrified Carver by the collar, shoving him into the room. "This man has something to say," Jedediah said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. All eyes turned to Carver, pushed into the center of the room, trembling under the weight of 100 accusing stares. The henchman completely fell apart. "He made me do it!" Carver shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Silas. "Blackwood! He paid me! I cut the saddle cinch. I waited at the ravine. He said Calloway was a problem that needed to be solved, and he had me plant the watch on this man, too. It was all him. All of it." The saloon exploded into chaos. The confession, public and undeniable, shattered Blackwood's empire in a single instant. Men who had long suffered under his thumb now shouted for his head. The edifice of fear he had built for years crumbled into dust. Sheriff Barnes, his face white with terror at his own exposure, drew his pistol. "Silas, you are under arrest!" he yelled, trying to save his own skin. Silas Blackwood, cornered and undone, reacted like the animal he was. With a guttural roar of rage, he pulled his own gun. He was not aiming for the sheriff. He was aiming for Alara, the source of his ruin. But in the panicked, surging crowd, another man had found a final, desperate ounce of courage. Ben Tully, the old stable hand, sober for the first time in years, had come to see justice done. He saw Silas raise the gun, and in a single, selfless act of redemption, he lunged forward, shoving Alara out of the way. The gun fired. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Ben Tully cried out and crumpled to the floor. In the same instant, Jedediah's pistol, which had appeared in his hand as if by magic, bucked and roared. Silas Blackwood staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before collapsing behind the bar. Silence, thick and absolute, fell over the room. It was broken only by a woman's scream. Alara rushed to Ben Tully's side. The old man lay on the dusty floorboards, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He looked up at her, his eyes already glazing over. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. He had, in the end, been the man he once was. Then his eyes closed. The final, somber price for justice had been paid. The morning after felt like the morning after a great and terrible fever had broken. Redemption was quiet, but it was the unnerving, exhausted quiet of a sick room, not the quiet of peace. The body of Silas Blackwood had been removed from the saloon, as had the tragic, sober corpse of Ben Tully. The town was in shock, a collective state of disbelief and shame. The truth, when it had finally been laid bare, was a harsh and ugly mirror. The people of redemption were forced to look at themselves and see not a righteous community, but a town of silent accomplices, people who had allowed their fear and prejudice to be manipulated by a tyrant. They had whispered about Thomas's death but done nothing. They had condemned Alara in her grief and celebrated the arrest of an innocent man. Justice had been served, but it had left a bitter taste. Alara and Jedediah were the instruments of that justice, but they were not celebrated as heroes. They were viewed with a strange and unsettling mixture of awe, fear, and a lingering distrust. They were outsiders, catalysts for a violent upheaval that had exposed the town's rotten core. Their presence was a constant reminder of the community's own moral failure. When Alara walked down the street, people averted their eyes. not with the cold judgment of before, but with a new, shamed reluctance to meet her gaze. The scars left by Silas Blackwood were not only on her land, but on the soul of the entire town. In the chaos of the saloon, amidst the gunfire and shouting, no one had noticed at first that Jedediah had been hit. It was not a clean shot, but a ricochet, a jagged piece of lead that had torn through the muscle of his left side, just above his hip. He had ignored it, his focus entirely on the threat and its aftermath. But as the adrenaline faded, a searing pain took its place, and a dark stain began to spread across his shirt. Elara saw it, in the sudden, ringing silence after the violence, as people began to gather around the fallen. Her eyes were only for him. She saw him brace a hand against the bar, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. She crossed the room without a word, her newfound strength a solid, unyielding force. She pushed through the stunned onlookers, her focus absolute. "You are hurt," she stated, her voice low and steady. "It is nothing," he grunted, but a wave of dizziness made him sway. "It is not nothing," she countered, her tone leaving no room for argument. She tore a strip of cloth from a discarded apron and pressed it firmly against the wound. "We are leaving." She was no longer the one being rescued. She took charge, her movements efficient and sure. With the help of the shaken but sober blacksmith, she got Jedediah out of the saloon, away from the whispers and the staring eyes. She helped him onto his horse, her hands guiding him, her presence a firm support. She led him out of the town that had wronged them both, back toward the one place that had ever felt like a sanctuary, her small, lonely cabin. The roles were now completely reversed. The cabin, the place where he had once sat a silent vigil over her, now became his sickbed. The woman he had saved from the river now became his protector, his caregiver. She cleaned the wound with whiskey that made him hiss through his teeth, her touch gentle but firm, her face a mask of intense concentration. She stitched the ragged tear in his flesh with a steady hand, her movements practiced from years of mending farm animal injuries, though her heart pounded with a fear she refused to show. He was a large man, his body a landscape of old scars and hardened muscle, but under her care, he was rendered vulnerable, reliant. The days that followed were quiet and intensely intimate. The violent, loud world of men and their ambitions was shut outside the cabin door. Inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire, the scent of the herbal poultices she applied to his wound, and the low murmur of their infrequent conversations. She nursed him with a fierce, quiet devotion. She cooked him broth and bread, she kept the fire fed, and she sat in the chair by his bedside through the long, quiet nights, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. In this shared quiet, their physical and emotional wounds began to heal. The horror of the saloon, the grief for Ben Tully, the years of accumulated pain, all were allowed to settle, to be processed in the safe space they had created. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, her presence a calming balm on his restless soul. She would look at him, asleep in the dim light of the lantern, and feel a profound, aching tenderness that was deeper and more terrifying than anything she had ever known. They tended to each other, not with grand declarations, but with small, unspoken acts of care. It was in the way she adjusted his blankets, the way he would reach for her hand when a spasm of pain shot through him. They were two solitary, wounded creatures, learning to trust in the healing power of another's touch. As his body mended, the future began to assert itself, an unspoken question that hung in the air between them. The homestead was a wreck. The barn was a heap of charred bones. Their names were now forever tied to violence and tragedy in the memory of the town, and the ghosts of their pasts, though quieter now, were ever present. What now? Where did two people like them, forged in such a crucible of loss and justice, go from here? Jedediah was the first to face the question, and he answered it with the only instinct he had ever known. Once he was strong enough to walk without pain, to feel the solid ground beneath his feet. The old restlessness began to stir. He had been a drifter for so long that stillness felt like a danger. He looked at Alara, at the fragile peace that was beginning to bloom in her eyes, at the home they had accidentally, improbably, created in this small cabin. And he believed, with the grim certainty of a man who had seen his own family consumed by fire, that his presence was the greatest threat to that peace. He was a magnet for trouble, a man whose past would forever cast a long, dark shadow. He felt he had repaid his debt. He had helped her find justice for Thomas. He had rid her of Silas Blackwood. The only honorable thing left to do, the only way to truly keep her safe, was to disappear. Alara found him one morning by the corral, checking the cinch on his saddle, his bedroll and rifle already tied in place. He had not told her he was leaving, but she knew. The air was thick with the unspoken goodbye. A cold dread, familiar and sharp, gripped her heart, but she did not let it show on her face. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. He did not turn to face her, continuing to adjust a strap that needed no adjustment. "The wound is healed," he said, his voice rough. "I have stayed long enough. My part in this is done." "Your part?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "I repaid a debt," he said, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were full of a deep, familiar sorrow. "For your kindness. But a man like me, I only bring pain. Alara, you have a chance now to live a quiet life, to rebuild. You cannot do that with me here." She did not argue. She did not plead. Instead, she looked past him, her gaze settling on the blackened, skeletal remains of the barn. "Walk with me," she said. She led him to the ruins, to the place of her greatest loss and her greatest transformation. They stood together before the pile of charred timbers and ash, a monument to all they had endured and all they had lost. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. "Thomas and I laid the foundation stone right there," she said softly, pointing to a large, fire-blackened rock. "He said a foundation had to be strong enough to weather any storm. We thought we had built it strong enough." She looked at Jedediah, her eyes clear and direct. "For months, I could hardly say his name. It hurt too much. I felt like if I spoke of him, I was betraying him by being alive when he was not. But now I know the only betrayal is to forget." She took a deep breath. "His name was Thomas. He loved the smell of the earth after a rain, and he had a laugh that could make you feel warm even in winter. I loved him, and losing him almost destroyed me." Her courage, her willingness to face the ghost that stood between them, gave him the strength to face his own. He looked at the ashes, but he saw a different fire, a different time. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She made the best apple pies you have ever tasted. She used to sing when she worked. And my son was Daniel. He was only 5. He wanted to be a cowboy, but he was afraid of horses." A small, sad smile touched Jedediah's lips. He loved to collect rocks. His pockets were always full of them. They stood there for a long time, in the quiet company of their ghosts. They did not try to erase the pain or offer empty comfort. They simply acknowledged it, giving it voice, giving it space. They accepted that these tragedies, these people, were a part of who they were now. Their shared pasts were not chains holding them back, but the very foundations, scarred and fire-blackened, upon which they now stood. Finally, Jedediah turned away from the ruins and back toward his waiting horse. The time had come. "It is better this way. Alara," he said, his voice heavy with a finality that broke her heart. "I will only ever bring more of this." He took 2 steps toward his horse, toward a future of lonely horizons and endless wandering. "No," she said. He stopped, his back to her. "Do not leave." He turned around slowly. Her face was set, resolute. The desperate, frightened woman he had pulled from the river was gone forever. In her place stood a woman of iron, a woman who knew her own mind and her own heart, a woman who had faced down death and despair and the devil himself, and had won. "This is not a plea," she said, her voice ringing with a strength he had never heard before. "This is an offer. I am not asking you to stay and protect me. I am done being protected. I am asking you to stay and build with me." She took a step closer, her eyes locked on his. "The trouble is not in you, Jedediah. The trouble is in the world. It is in the hearts of men like Silas Blackwood. It lives in this very ground. Leaving will not keep me safe from it. It will only leave me alone to face it. I have been alone. I will not do it anymore." She was offering him not a sanctuary from his past, but a place to finally stop running from it. She was offering him a future, not despite his scars, but because of them. She understood him in a way no one else ever could. "Do not stay because you owe me a debt," she said, her voice softening. "Stay because this is home. Stay because we are stronger together than we are apart." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and he saw not a widow he had to save, but an equal, a partner, a woman as strong, as scarred, and as resilient as he was. He saw the end of a long, lonely road. He saw a place to lay down the ghosts he had carried for so long, the instinct to drift, the habit of a lifetime, fought against the pull of her words, against the hope he had not allowed himself to feel for years. And then it broke. The ghosts of Sarah and Daniel did not vanish, but they settled, finally at peace. They were not figures of torment anymore, but memories, sad and beautiful, of a love that had once been, and now, a new love, hard-won and forged in fire, stood before him, offering him not a way to forget, but a reason to live. A slow, tired, but genuine smile touched his lips. He let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 10 years. "All right, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. "I will stay." The story did not end with a dramatic kiss or a passionate embrace. It ended with a simple, profound image that held more promise than any easy gesture ever could. Jedediah unlashed his bedroll from his saddle and walked to stand beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. They stood side by side, equals, partners, survivors, and they looked together at the charred rubble of the barn. "It is a big mess," she said, a hint of a smile in her voice. "That it is," he agreed. He looked from the ashes to her, his gaze steady and clear. "Where do we begin?" She looked back at him, her heart full of a quiet, realistic, and hard-won glimmer of hope. "Together," she said. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to our channel from Wild West and share your thoughts in English.